There is an epidemic going on that no one is talking about. It has to do with the shape of our jaws. Now, this might not seem like a big deal, but when you start to understand the problem, you'll see why it is a big deal. The shape of our jaws has been getting smaller and smaller. If you don't believe me, look at some anthropology records and you'll see that our ancestors had very wide, spacious jaws. In turn, their mouths were able to hold all 32 of their teeth, including their wisdom teeth, and their teeth didn't come in crooked. Now keep in mind, they didn't have any braces or orthodontics back then. Now why is this a problem? Well, small jaws, surprisingly, are associated with a lot of different diseases. These include heart disease, eczema, lower IQ, depression, ADHD, Alzheimer's, and sleep apnea. Now, I think it's really important to talk about this because if you already hit puberty, you probably can't really change the shape of your jaw without getting a surgery. But there are still some things you can do to improve your airway. Your airway is basically the airflow in and out of your body and how easy it is for air to go from the outside air into your lungs. You see, the reason that all these diseases are associated with these smaller jaws is because when you have a smaller jaw, it makes it harder to breathe. That is the core issue that causes all these other diseases and all these other problems, including things like sleep apnea. And I actually think a lot of these other diseases that are associated with smaller jaws could be attributable to sleep apnea. Sleep apnea is a condition when people really struggle breathing when they're sleeping. What happens is when someone has sleep apnea and they're sleeping, their airway collapses. For example, one way this could happen would be if you're lying on your back and then your tongue falls all the way to the back of your throat and cuts off your breathing, and it basically chokes you. And sleep apnea is measured using something called an AHI index, or an apnea-hypopnea index. So there's two different things on this test. There's an apnea and a hypopnea. An apnea is when your breathing completely stops or when it reduces to just 10% of your normal breathing. So basically when you are choking. And if this goes on for 10 seconds straight, then that is called an apnea. Now a hypopnea, on the other hand, is a partial collapse of your airway. This is when you have really shallow breathing, but not quite to the point of an apnea, but it still has to last 10 seconds. Now an AHI index will measure how many times within an hour that you have one of these events. And if this happens between 5 and 15 times, then that's considered mild sleep apnea. If it happens 15 to 30 times, then it is moderate sleep apnea. If it happens more than 30 times, then you have severe sleep apnea. Now, if this happens, it's very bad because, for one, you're having very turbulent airflow, meaning it's not a constant, steady flow of air in and out of your body. At times, you'll be choking and you'll not be breathing, and at other times, you'll be taking a big gasp of air because you're dying to breathe. And the second reason this is bad is because your sleep will be drastically disrupted. You will have a really hard time getting the later stages of your sleep cycle and the deep sleep that your body needs to restore and be healthy if you keep waking up gasping for breath. This will also end up increasing your oxidative stress and increase the overall inflammation in your body. And this can contribute to a lot of other diseases. And it'll also make you chronically tired. Now, the thing is that the rates of sleep apnea have been going up. So this is from data from the National Council on Aging. They were looking at two studies, one from 1993 and one from 2013. In 1993, they found that about 11% of men and 4% of women had moderate to severe sleep apnea. And then in a follow-up in 2013, the numbers increased to 14% and 5% respectively. Now, the other thing is the risk of getting sleep apnea also increases the older that you get. Another study found that 56% of people that are 65 and older have a higher risk of getting sleep apnea. Now, part of the reason that more people are getting sleep apnea could be that more people are getting tested because more people are talking about it. But nonetheless, it is a problem that doesn't seem to be going away. In fact, it does seem to be getting worse. And this is exactly why I'm talking about it today, because the thing with sleep apnea is you don't just wake up one day and magically have sleep apnea. For a lot of people, it's actually a progressive disease where it starts off as more minor, and then as it continues to get worse, it can develop into a more severe disease, which ends up being sleep apnea. But if you're able to improve your breathing early on with some of the things that I'm going to talk about, then you could definitely prevent getting these issues. But I want to talk a little bit more about how sleep apnea is measured during a sleep study. So we talked about how it has to be 10 seconds for it to be counted as an apnea or a hypopnea and go in that AHI score. And when you're looking at a sleep study and you're looking at these events where people stop breathing, a sleep apnea is considered a major event. That means on a graph, it's going to be very obvious that that person stopped breathing. Now, the problem with this is other events where that person stops breathing could be ignored if it isn't this severe. For example, what if this collapse of your airway just isn't strong enough to be considered sleep apnea? I mean, I'd still be worried because my airway is still collapsing. Or what if it doesn't happen for a full 10 seconds? I'd still be worried. There was a sleep researcher named Dr. Jonas who did a lot of research on sleep and airway. And he found that you could also have a very minor collapse in your airway that wouldn't be this obvious spike in a sleep apnea test. But if this minor collapse is left undetected for a long time, then this could develop into sleep apnea. And the reason is the progression of this disease, for it to turn into sleep apnea, relies on chronic inflammation and chronic stress. And you get these two things when you have this turbulent airflow. So I know this can get a little technical, so I'm going to try to break it down a little bit more simple. When someone has sleep apnea, their body physically wakes up and their brain wakes up because they're choking and they're trying to breathe and survive. But other people can still have a collapse in their airway, but they don't wake up. Their body naturally responds and fixes it on its own. For example, if your tongue starts falling back and starts cutting off your breathing, your body's natural reflex could be to push that tongue back forward again to make room for oxygen to come in. And it can do all of this without waking up your brain. Now, in this case, it's good because you don't disrupt your sleep and then your body naturally fixes the problem. If something like this happens, it will not be detected usually on a sleep study. But here's the problem. The underlying problem is still there. You're still having a partial collapse of your breathing, even if it's not as severe to the point of sleep apnea. And in turn, you're still having a turbulent airflow. It's not very calm and steady where you're breathing in and breathing out very normally. At times, your body will be taking a gasp of air and then going back to normal breathing. Even if it's not severe, it's still very turbulent. And this can continue to get worse over time if it is not corrected, because this turbulent airflow will contribute to that chronic stress and that chronic inflammation, which will damage your body. And this could help explain why when people get older, they're at a higher risk for getting sleep apnea, because the underlying problem is never getting fixed. What Dr. Jonas also found was the problem will always start with some sort of anatomical limitation. And this comes back to our jaws getting smaller. Whether it's our tongue being too big for our mouth, or our tongue falling back, or our nose collapsing, or our nose being deviated. There could be a lot of different things that contribute to some anatomical problem limiting the amount of air that gets into our lungs. Now, this could be really scary because you could get a sleep study and think that you're perfectly fine because they say you don't have sleep apnea, but they could be ignoring that underlying problem. But luckily, some sleep researchers are measuring this. So what you can do is, if you're getting a sleep study, you can ask if they monitor PES, P-E-S, or esophageal pressure. Because when these sleep researchers also look at the pressure in your esophagus, they're able to see these smaller breathing events. They're not just looking for sleep apnea, they're also looking for these minor apneas. So that would be the first thing I would do. If you don't know how you're breathing when you're sleeping, or even if you snore, or if someone tells you that it looks like you're not really breathing properly when you're sleeping, then I would highly suggest that you get a sleep study, but also ask if they measure this esophageal pressure. Now, luckily, there are some simple ways to improve your breathing when you're sleeping without getting any sort of surgery or anything like that. The first is using a nasal dilator. So there's two different types. You can get an external dilator, which is just like a piece of tape that goes on the outside of your nose, or you can get an internal dilator. A common brand that I like is Mute, which just is like a clip and it goes on the inside of your nose and keeps everything open. Because some people, when they're breathing and they take a really deep inhale through their nose can collapse. You can even do this. You can go in front of a mirror and try to take a really deep inhale through your nose, kind of like this, and see if the outer part of your nose kind of goes in when you're taking that deep breath. Sometimes it can happen just to one side, and sometimes it can be more severe. Like sometimes it can completely close, or sometimes it can kind of partially close. Another thing you can do is take a mouth tape. Literally, like the name sounds, take a piece of tape, tape it over your mouth. The one that I like is something called 3M micropore paper tape. and it's literally the surgical medical grade tape that you can rip a piece off, it's safe for your skin, and then you tape it over your lips. I would only do this if you know for sure that you can breathe through your nose. If you know that you'll not be able to breathe through your nose all night, then that's another problem that we'll have to fix before you do this. But if you are able to breathe through your nose, then taping your mouth shut can really be all you need to do to prevent getting sleep apnea. When you breathe through your nose, you get better oxygen delivery throughout your body. You produce this molecule called nitric oxide, which helps dilate your blood vessels and improve the gas exchange in your lungs and basically make your breathing more efficient. And also, breathing through your nose will prevent your tongue from falling back in the back of your throat and cutting off your breathing. Now, I went more into detail in other videos about the benefits of nasal breathing versus mouth breathing, and I'm putting a link in the description below if you want to check that out too. Now, if you really struggle with breathing through your nose, there's a little exercise you can do to help open up your nose. Basically, all it is a normal inhale and exhale, and then after the exhale, you're gonna hold your breath and then jog in place. And you're gonna do this until you get this medium to strong urge to breathe again. And then once you get that medium urge to breathe, you're gonna recover by breathing through your nose for 1 minute. Then you're gonna repeat this exercise 6 times. What this basically does is it increases the carbon dioxide in your body, and in turn, it sends a signal to your brain to help open up your nose. So it'll look a little bit like this. So I'll keep doing that while holding my breath until I have this medium urge to breathe. The key here is you don't want to be dying to take your next breath. You should be able to recover your breathing in 1 to 2 breaths and then go back to normal breathing for that minute. After you do this 6 times, your nose should be a lot more open. Now, the thing here is you might start to get a lot of drainage when you do this, because when you start to open up your nose and your nose has been dormant for a while, then you can have all this mucus that kind of drains out because your nose is opening up. So make sure you keep blowing your nose. You might have to use like a saline rinse to help clean out all that mucus and help keep your nose open. After a couple weeks of doing this, then your nose should really be a lot better. Now, I did go into detail on how to properly unblock your nose. That was kind of a simplified version. So if that didn't work for you, make sure you check out the full video in the description below. Now, I will say that if you tried everything and you just cannot breathe through your nose all night long, then I would definitely go to an ear, nose, and throat doctor, because it is not normal to not be able to breathe through your nose. There is an underlying problem that you have to fix. Otherwise, it can definitely lead to issues later on like sleep apnea. You can also try going for jogs or going for walks and focusing on only breathing through your nose. And that, again, will also help improve the carbon dioxide tolerance in your body, which in turn will help open up your nose even more. Now, I know I mentioned how our jaws have been getting smaller, and a lot of people think that this could be genetics, that our genetics are causing our teeth to be crooked, our wisdom teeth to grow in impacted and need to get extracted. But it's not necessarily the genetics that's causing this. It's actually more of a change in our phenotype. Our phenotype is the expression of our genes. It's kind of like working out. If someone starts working out their bicep and the other person doesn't do anything, they're both still gonna have a bicep, but one person's bicep is gonna be bigger than the other. It's the same thing with our jaws. If we don't grow up chewing food enough and stimulating the stem cells in our jaws enough, then our jaws are gonna start to grow more narrow and have our teeth come in more crooked because there's less room for them to come in. If you look back, these changes in our jaws really started happening after industrialization. There were some minor changes in our jaw shapes before that, but these changes were very subtle and took a long time to happen. But we started seeing drastic changes in our jaws in just the last 300 years. The reason is foods have become softer and people started chewing a lot less. And part of the reason also is we started moving indoors where there's a lot more dust and different allergens. Our ancestors used to chew food about 4 hours a day. I can't remember the last time I chewed more than like 30 minutes in a whole day. And in turn, we don't really engage the stem cells in our jaws, because if we grew up chewing food like our ancestors did, then our jaws would start to grow more forward and wide. Again, our ancestors never had crooked teeth, and their wisdom teeth even came in all in the right place, and they never needed to get extracted really. That is unheard of now. Pretty much everyone has crooked teeth to some degree. And they even did studies on cats. Like back in the 1930s, there was a study where they took cats and they fed them softer food diets growing up. And they saw that even those cats had jaw development problems. So if you're an adult like me watching this, well, you're thinking, well, I'm out of luck because there's nothing I can do now to fix all these problems if my jaw is already developed. But hopefully you can use some of this knowledge to help your child. Some simple tips are making sure they have proper posture when they're eating, making sure they're chewing with their mouth closed, chewing evenly on both sides, and making sure they're thoroughly chewing their food. Ultimately, we're never gonna have the same jaw development our ancestors did because we're just not doing the same things. But at least we can try to help. But luckily, if you do some of the things I mentioned to improve your breathing, you can still help prevent a lot of these issues down the road. And again, if you still have problems with your breathing, make sure you go visit your ENT or your ear, nose, and throat doctor. Thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you in the next video. Look, everyone wants a healthy mouth, everyone wants a nice white smile, and no one wants to wake up with tooth pain. So you gotta stop making these mistakes with your mouth. Number one is brushing your teeth after breakfast. I never really understood this because I personally can't really eat breakfast unless my mouth is clean first. But